welcome to ODI. I'm Tom Mitchell. I head the Climate and Environment Programme here at ODI, and somebody who's been working for the last few years on the Future Disaster Risk Reduction Framework. This event, titled How to Include and Empower the Vulnerable in Disaster Risk Reduction, is very much allied to the international process that we're involved in now towards a new international agreement for disaster risk reduction. And it's really my great pleasure to welcome you and a very experienced, insightful panel here to talk about this issue. Also recognising our online audience and really do hope that those online and watching online can participate in the discussion afterwards. Let me just give you a few words on how we intend to run this afternoon. A little bit of a departure from ODI events if you've been to ODI events before. We have the panelists here, where we're going to introduce them one by one as we run through, asking Emma to start with to talk to the paper that you see sat on your chairs, and then ask each of the other panelists to talk from the perspective of their work and their experience in terms of the way in which at-risk groups and the at-risk groups in which they represent and work with are included in the Hyogo Framework for Action 2 document and the work that they've been doing in that regard. We're also lucky to have people on the line, Jake from the Philippines and Annie from India as well, who'll be contributing as long as the line stays clear and we can hold that up. But so that would be short interjections from each of the panelists, and then what we'd like to do is move into an approach really for the last hour of the session, where we try and jointly draft something as a conclusion from this meeting and from the expertise that we're drawing on, that can be offered to member states as our commentary on where the process stands and what's really needed in terms of the future agreement on disaster risk reduction. So the panelists here have been doing a little bit of homework over the last 2 hours and have come up with some suggestions of where we can jointly agree that there needs to be either elements kept within the draft document or that there needs to be new elements introduced. And therefore we'd like to put that up on the screen and get all your inputs and comments on that, with the view of actually trying to come to some conclusions about key messages for governments. And then to actually take that beyond this meeting and channel that to those governments that we think can make most difference in improving the document. So we're hoping this can be a kind of a live, multi-headed, multi-sited kind of input to a process that certainly needs expert input and insights from those working in this area. So apologies for a longer than normal introduction, but let me hand on to start with to Emma Lovell, a research officer in our adaptation and resilience team at ODI, who's been working with Virginie Masson to produce the paper that you see sat on your chairs. For those online, it's available on the ODI website, CDKN website. The paper is available on equity and inclusion in disaster risk reduction, building resilience for all. It's for all. Emma, over to you.
Thank you, Tom. And thank you, everyone, for coming. Policymakers and international organisations are currently negotiating the post-2015 framework for disaster risk reduction, which is going to be agreed at Sendai in March 2015. The Zero Draft acknowledges gender, age, disability and cultural perspectives in disaster risk reduction. It also recognises that there are different levels of vulnerability and exposure and the need to empower vulnerable groups to participate in decision-making and implementation. It does not, however, say how socio-cultural dimensions will be promoted, accounted for, and by whom. As a guide to some of the important aspects that should be included in the post-2015 framework, ODI and CDKN have recently produced the Future Framework for Disaster Risk Reduction. The paper that Virginie and I are launching today expands on the guide and also attempts to address some of the shortcomings of the Zero Draft. It aims to move the debate beyond the need to include vulnerable groups into a more of an empowerment angle. It promotes the need for socio and economic and cultural inclusion and the political recognition of marginalised people, and provides examples of where participation as active agents of change have been beneficial to build resilience effectively and equitably. The paper focuses on 4 main points. First, marginalised groups are more likely to suffer from disasters. Second, disasters exacerbate vulnerabilities and social inequalities. Third, vulnerable groups tend to be excluded from DRR decision-making, thus making them even more vulnerable to the impacts of disasters. And finally, vulnerable groups should be included in DRR as active agents of change to effectively and equitably build resilience. I'm now going to go through these few points in a bit more detail. Globally, exposure to natural hazards is increasing as more people and assets are located in hazard-prone areas. This is due to population growth, economic pressure, and more people living in coastal and exposed areas, as well as loss or degradation of natural ecosystems. At the same time, people's vulnerability to natural hazards and their capacity to cope, manage, and respond to disasters is dependent on socioeconomic, cultural, and political factors that influence how hazards affect people in different ways. At-risk people are more likely to suffer disproportionately from disasters, regardless of whether they live in poor or rich countries. This is due to poor living conditions, inadequate infrastructure, a lack of income diversification, and limited access to basic services. This figure shows that despite similar hazard strength, in these examples, disaster-related mortality is worse in poor countries. People are marginalised and face a denial of their human rights and are often discriminated against on the basis of their gender, age, disability, culture, religion, and so on. This makes them even more vulnerable to natural disasters. There are a number of contributing factors why women are more affected than men in disasters. This can be down to gendered roles and responsibilities, reproductive or productive activities. At the same time, social restrictions may limit their mobility, and political systems may prevent recognition of their needs and perspectives. Disasters are a global challenge that threaten to reverse years of development gains and prevent us from reaching international efforts to end poverty by 2030. Not only are people living in poverty and marginalised groups more likely to suffer the effects of disasters, but disasters also exacerbate vulnerabilities and social inequalities. Just 1 or 2 extreme events could have devastating consequences on development gains and can affect health, education, income, and employment opportunities, thereby trapping people in poverty. At the same time, repetitive small-scale events can have a similar impact as populations are unable to resist, cope, or recover from disasters. From years of experience, we know that disasters prevent children from going to school, that can affect their education and exacerbate their vulnerability. There are complex links between disasters, vulnerability, education, and the rights and roles of children and young people. And this needs to have a much stronger recognition in the post-2015 framework, and it's our duty to take this into account. People who are at risk of disasters face multiple exclusions. This can be from socio-economic, cultural, or political exclusions that exacerbate their vulnerability, partly by preventing them from participating in decision-making that affects their lives. Disaster risk reduction planning and implementation overlooks social dynamics, power relations, and the diversity of needs, skills, knowledge, and capacities of people facing disasters. Disaster risk reduction monitoring and evaluation also lacks disaggregated data by sex, age, disability, and ethnicity. People with disability report that they are rarely consulted about their needs, despite being in the best position to recognize them and know how to meet them before, during, and after a disaster. In the 2013 UN Global Survey of Persons Living in Disabilities on how they cope with disasters, 71% of respondents said they have no personal preparedness plan for disasters. 31% said they always have someone to help them evacuate, and 13% said they never have anyone to help them evacuate. The focus on vulnerable groups does not recognize the numerous ways that marginalized people cope with and manage to recover from disasters. Disaster risk reduction interventions need to acknowledge and draw upon local and traditional knowledge and people's perspectives, capacities, skills, and experience in order to effectively and equitably build resilience. Child-centered initiatives can strengthen adaptive capacity and empower children as active agents of change. Children and young people can act as key informants to communicate and increase awareness about natural hazards and disaster risk reduction activities. They have also demonstrated the ability to identify roles and responsibilities within families and communities. It is essential, however, that participation is meaningful and avoids tokenism or manipulation through organizations having other political agendas, and that there is not too large a burden placed on the child and that adults or organizations play a supportive role. The lack of attention to sociocultural factors, including gender, age, disability, and other elements of social difference, undermines the effectiveness and sustainability of disaster risk reduction. The paper demonstrates that building an understanding of human rights and valuing different sociocultural perspectives, knowledge, and capacities within decision-making processes are all key to building resilience and increasing the capacity of the most vulnerable groups to natural hazards. To address vulnerability to risk and foster social inclusion adequately, DRR planning must be inclusive, based on context-specific analysis of people's vulnerabilities, and act upon inequalities between people's identities, statuses, and roles, and draw on their capacities. This paper makes a set of recommendations for the post-2015 framework for disaster risk reduction, which can be found on page 12 of the working paper. And I hope we'll be able to speak about some of these later in the event. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Emma.